I admire Tolkien greatly. His books had enormous influence on me, and the trope that he sort of established, the idea of the Dark Lord and his evil minions, in the hands of lesser writers over the years and decades, has not served the genre well. It has been beaten to death. The battle of good and evil is a great subject for any book and certainly for a fantasy book, but I think ultimately the battle between good and evil is weighed within the individual human heart, and not necessarily between an army of people dressed in white and an army of people dressed in black. When I look at the world, I see that most real, living, breathing human beings are grey. My Golvanan and Vala Magules friends, Yoistin here, and I hope you all are doing well wherever you are in Middle-earth or Westeros. From the title and intro of this video, we will be talking about, you all guessed it, Tolkien's works and J.R.R. Martin's works. We will be looking at some of the similarities and differences between the two fandoms in the spirit of the Game of Thrones television show coming to an end in the next week. Now this will be a somewhat brief overview that compares and contrasts the two franchises, as there are so many elements that could make for a really long series of videos. We will start with some of the surface level and major similarities and differences between the lores, before looking at a few of the similarities and differences in the Lord of the Rings movies and the Game of Thrones show, and then the Lord of the Rings books and the Song of Ice and Fire books. Before I go any further, there will be spoilers for both the Game of Thrones TV show through Season 8, Episode 4, and the Song of Ice and Fire books, so this is an official spoiler warning. Since I definitely won't be able to cover everything in this video, let me know your thoughts and additions in the comments below. Thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. To begin with some surface level stuff, some of the names in A Game of Thrones show and book are from Middle-earth with perhaps some slight spelling variations. These may be coincidental, but some do seem purposeful, and this may also just be Martin paying homage to the Professor. Along the wall there is a Castle Oakenshield, which is also the title for Thorin Oakenshield, whose story takes place in The Hobbit. The Rains of Castamere were a house that rose up in a rebellion against Tywin Lannister's father Tytos, until Tywin utterly wiped out House Rain. Castamere the Usurper led the Kinstrife in Gondor, rebelling against the true heir of the throne until King Eldacar took the throne of Gondor back. King Eldacar himself would kill Castamere. This one is a bit of a stretch, but there's House Umber in the north, and Umbar is a land of corsairs south of Gondor. Khal Drogo is, as we all know, the husband of Daenerys Targaryen in the first book and season of Game of Thrones, and he was killed before he came to cross the Narrow Sea. Drogo Baggins is the father of Frodo Baggins, and he met his end in the Brandywine River during a boating accident. Samwell Tarly is a friend to Jon Snow, while our faithful Samwise Gamgee is a friend to Frodo Baggins. Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, was a famous swordsman in the Seven Kingdoms, while Arthedain was one of the kingdoms of the Dunedain after Arnor was divided into 3 parts. A warg in A Song of Ice and Fire is a person that may enter the minds of animals and control them, while wargs in Middle-earth are a race of evil wolves. Finally, George Raymond Richard Martin goes by J.R.R. Martin, just as John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was known as J.R.R. Tolkien. The 2 R's in the pen names may have been coincidental, but I have heard that Martin put the 2 R's in his pen name as a reverence to Tolkien, rather than just going by George Martin. To go a bit deeper into the lore aspects of both works, if we look at the major kindreds in Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, the Valyrians and their physical descriptions of having silver gold hair is very reminiscent of the Vanyar elves, who had blonde hair and were most revered by men of all elven kind. Now Valyria and its fall is similar to the downfall of Numenor, as geographical doom came to both kingdoms. The descendants of the Valyrians are Targaryens, and they seem to have special qualities, such as, at times, being immune to fire. The descendants of Numenor are also blessed with long life and other gifts of the men of the West. The Targaryens survived the doom of Valyria and would go on to rule in Westeros, and some of the Númenóreans that survived the downfall of Numenor were Elendil and his sons, who would go on to rule Arnor and Gondor in Middle-earth. The Children of the Forest seem to be Martin's stand-in for hobbits, ents, and druidain, as they are wardens of nature and are simpler in their actions than men are. The first men are like to the Middlemen, or the men of Rohan and Dale in certain ways, as they are somewhat barbaric and rustic in nature. The Andals remind me of the Easterlings and Haradrim, who came from the east later and made war with the First Men or Middlemen respectively. And the Rhoynar who settled in Dorne after their wars with Valyria are alike to the Black Númenóreans and Corsairs who settled in Umbar during and after their battles with the Dunedain. Or the 3 types of men in Westeros may be a reflection on the 3 houses of the Edain, or men who came into Beleriand in the Silmarillion. There are definitely some similarities here. And of course, the White Walkers, or the Others, and their whites, at least in this point in the books and show, are akin to orcs. They are both creatures that make war upon that which is alive and good. However, this might actually come to be different in A Song of Ice and Fire, but we will discuss that more in a bit. In the books and show both, Jon Snow, Robb Stark, and Eddard Stark seem to be stand-in characters for Aragorn. They are the archetypal hero warriors that seek to accomplish good. It seems that Arya Stark, at least in the show, is a stand-in for Frodo, for the actions of both characters lead to the downfall of the great evils, the Night King and Sauron respectively, although Gollum was ultimately the reason Sauron fell. Some of the supporting characters in Westeros are also alike to some supporting characters in The Lord of the Rings, such as the Sams that we mentioned previously, but Martin's works also diverge from Tolkien's works in a great way. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo and Aragorn remain the protagonists, while in A Song of Ice and Fire, the main characters are generally seen as Jon, Daenerys, and Tyrion, but other supporting characters have come to take leading roles in recent books, such as Theon, Cersei, and others. Now, in terms of the major themes for the Tolkien books and films, and the Martin books and show, it is clear that J.R.R. Martin wanted to implement some archetypes in his works from Tolkien's works, but diverged from them in major ways. This is depicted by the deaths of the Aragorn stand-in characters, Eddard, Robb, and Jon, and the promotion of characters with immoral motives, such as Cersei. And while I would argue that the characters of Tolkien's works are indeed three-dimensional and have certain gray areas, which I will delve into more in another video, Martin purposefully created characters that have gray moralities, such as Stannis, Jaime, and Tyrion, which are shown in both the books and the show. While certain metaphysical and story elements such as soft magic systems, glass candles that are reminiscent of Palantiri, kinslaying, and others are similar in both lores, other elements in Westeros and Essos, such as different religions, the inclusion of an abundance of sexual activity, and politics are more heavily featured in Martin's works. On the other hand, I would argue that Tolkien's works are more concerned with names, language, history, and other devices than Martin's works are. With all of that said, let's look more specifically at the Lord of the Rings movies and the Game of Thrones TV show. From the beginning of both the movies and the show, it is clear that the two are quite different pieces of fantasy. In The Fellowship of the Ring, we start with the War of the Last Alliance before seeing the peaceful land of the Shire and going on the adventure. In Game of Thrones, the White Walkers appear, some people die, and we see the frigid castle of Winterfell before a deserter from the Wall is beheaded. Yikes. While both franchises are fantasy, they are clearly different thematically and tonally in the beginning and throughout most of the movies and show. However, like I mentioned before, many of the characters are alike to Tolkien's characters, but many of them do not get happy endings, as we see with the death of Ned Stark at the end of the first season. But as the show went on, I would say that the recent seasons have bridged much of the divide between The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Jon charges into battle during the Battle of the Bastards like Aragorn does at the Black Gate, and they both make it out alive. The Battle of Winterfell was very reminiscent of the Battle of Helm's Deep, and honestly I wouldn't be surprised if the battle at King's Landing is somewhat alike to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and the Battle of the Black Gate, as the former is a siege battle, and the latter is fought out of desperation by the Free Peoples to end the war. And just as Frodo's actions led to the destruction of the One Ring, defeating the archetypal evil villain and all of his orcs, Arya killed the Night King, and that action ended all of his whites as well. Again, the show in certain ways has become more like a classic fantasy than one that juxtaposes classic story moments. We will have to see if the show continues this trend throughout its final 2 episodes or continues to contradict archetypes as it did in its early seasons. Looking at the books now, Tolkien revolutionized and created modern fantasy as we know it today. Martin was heavily inspired by Tolkien, and the death of Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring told Martin that one does not have to abide by genre archetypes in killing its characters, turning him into the lovable serial-killing author that we all know today. Again, while his books are set on many fantasy elements that Tolkien laid out, he takes those expectations of fantasies that we all have and turns them on their heads. Heroes are not as glorious as we expect them to be, nor are some villains as terrible as we thought they would be. It is even possible that the others, or the White Walkers, are not wholly evil, or at least not without cause. In the books, Sauron nor his master Melkor are simply just evil either. Sauron wishes for there to be order, and he would rule over that order. Melkor also wishes to be the ruler of Arda in his own fashion, rather than to destroy and kill everything. But I expect Martin may go further than that, turning the others into a faction that we may come to even empathize with. It is possible, at least. I also doubt that there will be a Night King whose death would mean the fall of his empire, as Sauron's death mostly means in The Lord of the Rings. If there is a Night King and he is killed, I doubt it would be like the destruction of the One Ring, and there would be another White Walker to take his place. Rather than there being one or two evil factions such as Mordor and Isengard, there are multiple factions that act in their own interest in A Song of Ice and Fire. Again, Martin likes to change the playing field of fantasy, and I definitely respect him for that. He pays homage to Tolkien's works while expanding and modifying the genre, which is incredible to see. Personally, Tolkien's works will always be my favorite fantasy, but I very much appreciate and respect Martin's works as well, which I hope is evident in this video. That being said, I think this is a perfect place to end the episode. From the similarities and differences between Tolkien and Martin's fantasies, we see how inspiration can create and further fantasy. It should not be about Tolkien versus Martin. Rather, we should revere both of these renowned authors and their contributions to literature and the world at large. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on the similarities and differences between The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, or Tolkien's works and Martin's works at large? Let me know in the comments below, and also be sure to leave any thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections in the comments as well. After the Game of Thrones episode tonight and next week's episode, I'll also leave some updated thoughts in the comments too. I'm going to link 2 very good Game of Thrones channels in the description, RedTeamReview and Preston Jacobs. Those channels have inspired me heavily over the years, so please check them out and let them know that the Men of the West send their regards. Also, be sure to check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and consider donating to our Patreon for our podcast and Discord server in the description below. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a video about the order I would recommend reading Tolkien's works in and why. As always, thank you all so much for your support and for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.